Object folder tape should have been a simple misfiled reel in a basement archive. Nothing more exotic than that. If the cover sheet were telling the truth, it would be a blank recording from a forgotten test. The sort of thing technicians label in pencil and then never think about again. Instead, the official name is typed in black ink with the weight of a verdict. Object folder tape. Recording of unknown semantic carrier. No acoustic signal. Associated with anomalous equipment response and coherent subjective impressions. And on the inner flap, in handwriting that is careful but very tired, someone has written a version that sounds closer to what they actually believed they were dealing with. The KGB recording that spoke without words. According to the top summary, technicians in a Soviet-era lab once reviewed a fading signal captured on a reel that contained no voice and no audible sound, yet consistently conveyed meaning to those exposed. An anomaly surfaced in the spectrogram readings, followed by unusual reaction in surrounding monitoring equipment. Moments later, a strange shift appeared across the final decoding logs, quietly noted by the KGB unit responsible for the recording, and then buried behind more acceptable projects. If you stop there, it sounds like the usual folklore that grows in the cracks between official reports. The problem is, the file is not folklore. It is written with the stiff, reluctant precision of people trying to describe something they are sure will be used against them, if they sound even slightly superstitious. The earliest documents don't mention the tape at all. They're about a room. On the inventory list, it's called Sound Room 3, a modest acoustic chamber in the basement of a research institute on the outskirts of a city that does not like to be named in these files. The building above it belongs to a respectable, boring-sounding establishment, an institute for speech, communication, and information transfer. If you look at a map, it's almost comically ordinary. Rows of low concrete structures, an inner courtyard where employees smoke, a small fountain whose pump works when someone remembers to fix it. The kind of place that produces academic papers about articulation, thresholds, and delay lines, and, more discreetly, technical reports for agencies that care very much about how messages travel from one mind to another. Sound Room 3 is one of the older chambers, built in the early wave of enthusiasm when the Institute still believed it would change the world with better microphones and smarter codes. It's a small cube lined with thick, absorbent panels, a recording deck on a metal trolley, cables snaking across the floor. No windows. A single heavy door with a porthole of glass that looks into darkness even when the light is on. For years, it does nothing dramatic. Students record vowel charts. Engineers test new filters. Occasionally, a small group from a nearby factory comes in for hearing tests, sitting in a row of plastic chairs while a technician presses buttons and raises their eyebrows at the dials. The first odd entry is buried in a maintenance log from late autumn. Playback unit in Sound Room 3 exhibits intermittent failure, the technician notes. On several occasions during evening shift, reel continues to spin with no audible output, despite correct threading and level settings. Meter bridge shows low-level activity. Swapping head assembly and amplifier does not resolve. Behavior not reproducible during daytime tests. Recommend further inspection or replacement when budget allows. He files the report and probably forgets about it. The lab has other problems. Deliverables, deadlines, staff shortages. A misbehaving deck is annoying, not mysterious. The tape enters the story by accident. Every institute has its graveyard shelves. metal racks in back rooms where reels, cassettes, and boxes of old media sit in leaning stacks, labeled in a shorthand only the people who made them can fully read. Tests 81B, Children, Noise, Codex 12. One winter, when the Institute is tasked with updating its sound archives and transferring anything valuable to a newer format, a junior technician is told to work through one of those racks and make a list of potentially useful material. He is given a trolley, a clipboard, and a simple instruction. If it sounds like anything other than static or random noise, write it down. Hours into this gray task, the technician pulls down a cardboard folder that is heavier than it looks. It's one of those plain archive folders with a metal clip inside, the kind meant for paper, not magnetic tape. Some previous custodian has ignored that and jammed a reel into it anyway, padding the inner sides with yellowing printouts to keep the metal from tearing through. On the front, in fading pencil, is written Room 3, Residual. Below that, a date, then a line someone has tried to erase and written over with a number. There is no project code, no title, no subject. For an institute that catalogs everything, this is as close to anonymous as an object gets. The technician shrugs, notes the lack of description, and brings the whole bundle to Sound Room 3 for a quick listen. If it's nothing, it goes in the scrap or erasure bin. If it's something, he writes a new label and moves on. He does the same thing dozens of times a day. Put reel on deck, thread tape, adjust levels, press play, listen for a minute, jot down man reading list of numbers, or street noise, traffic, or test tone sequence, then slip the reel into a new box or condemn it to recycling. There is no reason for him to expect anything different this time. If the tape in the folder had been important, someone would have written more than a single ambiguous word on it. He opens the folder and immediately understands why the reel was stored like this. The tape is not in a proper canister. It sits loose, wound around a cheap metal hub, its outer layers uneven, as if someone wound it by hand in a hurry. Threads of old paper cling to the edges where the printouts have stuck. The whole thing smells faintly of dust and something else, the stale tang of air that's been trapped in a sealed space for a long time. He brushes it off, mounts it on the left spindle, adds an empty take-up reel on the right, guides the tape through the path, over one roller, under another, across the head assembly. He checks tension, sets the level knob to a comfortable starting point, and presses the heavy square play button. The reels turn, the tape moves, the meters flicker gently in green, and the room stays silent. Not silent like nothing has started yet. Silent like someone has turned the world down half a notch. The air feels oddly thick. The technician checks the headphones, thinking maybe the connection is loose. He hears the faint hiss of his own equipment when he taps the casing. When he switches the selector from tape to inputs, the room comes back. The murmur of the building through the walls, the soft rattle of the ventilation fan. When he switches back to tape, that layer disappears. The meters continue to dance. It's not dramatic, just a fine trembling in the needles. Enough to say something is on the tape. Not enough to tell him what. He leans closer, adjusts the gain. Nothing emerges, no voice, no tone, just an absence shaped like listening. He writes later in his incident report. Subjective impression at this stage is that the tape carries signal outside audible band or at level below threshold of perception. No obvious artifacts, clicks, or crackle. That is not the whole truth. It is the piece he thinks he can write without sounding foolish. What he does not write is that after about 30 seconds of this non-sound, he finds himself nodding along. Not in time to any rhythm he can identify, but as if there were an invisible speech flow he's agreeing with. His hand, hovering over the stop button, hesitates when his mind supplies the quiet impression. Not yet, this part is important. He stops the tape anyway. He is a technician, not a mystic. He rewinds, checks the threading, plugs the headphones into a different socket. Plays again. The same thing happens. Silence, meters moving. That strange sense that he is following something just beyond reach. At this point, he has enough sense to call someone. The senior engineer on duty that night is the kind of man who believes in faults, not hauntings. He arrives annoyed, takes the headphones, and orders the junior to run the tape from the start. Later, both of them will remember the same sequence of events, with minor variations. The senior hears nothing. He says so. He keeps listening because that's his job. After a while, he frowns in a way the junior has never seen on his face, as if he's trying to recall a word that keeps slipping away. He takes off the headphones, checks the meters, taps the gauge. Then, he does something that will eventually bring the object to the attention of the security agency. He sits down and listens again without telling the younger man to leave. This time, they both hear nothing together. But something happens. The report phrases it as coinciding subjective experience of narrative comprehension in absence of acoustic content. In more human terms, both men have the strong, quiet impression that they are being told a story. Not a specific one, not yet. Just that someone, somewhere, is speaking to them at length, and that what is being said has structure. Phrases, pauses, a beginning, escalation, turns. Argument, maybe, confession, sermon. It's hard to say. When the tape's leader finally slaps against the reel and the deck stops with its usual soft clunk, they both feel the same low-grade irritation you feel when a program is cut off mid-sentence. The senior engineer is the first to speak. "Did you understand any of that?" he asks, instantly regretting the phrasing. The junior hesitates. He is smart enough to know this is the kind of question that can make you look very foolish, very quickly. "I had the impression of meaning," he says carefully. "Like when you listen to a language you don't know, but can tell where the sentences end." The senior considers this. He is not a man given to poetic description, but he cannot deny the similar sensation. He writes later, "Shared sense of structured content despite lack of audible signal. No emotional overload, no overt suggestion. Only persistent impression of organized communication." They could have put the folder back on the shelf and called it a corrupted reel. Many would have. But the Institute exists to investigate how messages work. And the senior engineer has spent enough years listening to jammed frequencies and coded broadcasts to recognize when something is not behaving like ordinary noise. He orders a proper analysis. The next day, Soundroom 3 is given to one of the Institute's quiet specialists, a woman whose entire career revolves around spectrograms and the mathematics of sound. She processes radio chirps, whale songs, machine vibrations, anything that can be turned into a smear of colors and lines against time and frequency. She is paid to see patterns where others see only mess. She runs the tape through the best equipment they have. Not just once, but a dozen times, varying speed, filters, sampling windows, She prints out spectrograms from floor to ceiling, tapes them to the walls of her lab until the room looks like the inside of a strange, monochrome aquarium. The oddity shows up immediately. In the normal human hearing band, the tape is remarkably clean. There's a faint, flat noise floor where you'd expect tape hiss, but no peaks, no formants, no sudden bursts. Nothing that looks like speech, music, or machinery. It is as if someone recorded the sound of a perfectly insulated void. Above and below that band, however, the spectrogram is not empty. There are faint, thread-like structures in the near ultrasonic range, and again, surprisingly, at extremely low frequencies, dipping toward the limits of what the equipment can represent. They are not strong, they are almost lost in the grain, but they have a stubborn coherence. They repeat, they cluster, they shape themselves in arcs and bends she has seen only rarely, and never together like this. They look, she writes in her first memo, like two halves of a ladder whose rungs have been erased. She doesn't say they are speech. She says they are non-random. That word is enough. The Institute's director, who has been looking for an excuse to demonstrate relevance to agencies that control his budget, makes a few discreet calls. Within a week, a man from the security services arrives with a briefcase, a neutral expression, and a clearance letter that says he is now entitled to know everything about object folder tape. From this point on, the file splits again. What the Institute thinks it is doing, and what the KGB thinks it might have found. The origin of the tape becomes the first contested ground. The cardboard folder offers almost no help. Room 3, residual. A scratched out line. A date that doesn't match any major project in the Institute's calendar. They search paper logs, lab books, old project binders. They find hints. Sound Room 3 had been used, a year before the tape was labeled, for an experiment in semantic compression. The goal had been to find new ways to stuff meaning into narrow band channels. In simple terms, to teach speech to squeeze itself without losing too much sense. One of those trials had involved recording long segments of spoken text and then subjecting them to aggressive filtering, clipping, and recombination to see how much could be removed while naive listeners still understood the message. It was a brutal process. Words were chopped, gaps stretched, frequencies gutted. They called it bleaching in their internal jokes. The researchers responsible for that work had moved on years ago. One had died. Another was now at a different institute, working on visual perception. The few still on site remembered late nights, poor coffee, and a sense that they were trying to strangle language into a smaller shape than it liked. It is plausible, they concede, that the tape in the folder is a leftover from those days. Perhaps it's a segment that was filtered so aggressively that nothing audible survived, kept out of habit or forgetfulness. Residual would fit that. The KGB man, who has spent enough time reading between lines, is not satisfied. If this is waste, he asks, why was it stored at all? Why in a folder rather than in a canister like other test tapes? Why is there a date underlined and then overwritten? No one has a good answer. They bring in the surviving lead from the compression project, a pale man with trembling fingers who now teaches first-year students about the basics of signal-to-noise ratios. He remembers recording sessions in Sound Room 3, but when shown the tape in the folder, he simply shakes his head. We erased almost everything, he says. We were always short of tape. Anything that didn't work went back on the shelf to be recorded over. I don't recall keeping a blank on purpose. that would have been wasteful. Could you have written residual on it? The director presses. I don't write words like that on things I don't care about, the man replies quietly. The KGB man notes this. Later, in his own restricted memo, he writes, "It is possible that the tape represents an extreme stage of the compression experiments, kept for curiosity, then forgotten. It is also possible that the label residual was meant to conceal an asset under a mundane term." From here, the file focuses less on where folder tape came from, and more on what it does to people who try to decode it. The first formal listening sessions happen under controlled conditions. They recruit a series of volunteers from within the institute. Engineers, secretaries, junior researchers, and a few from outside, mostly clerks from nearby offices who can be compensated with small bonuses and the novelty of participating in an experiment. Each subject is brought into Sound Room 3, seated in the chair, fitted with good headphones. They are told they will hear a recording. They are not told what kind. Some are warned there may be nothing at all. They are asked to listen carefully and, afterward, describe anything they experience. Sounds, impressions, feelings. The sessions are run double-blind. The operator in the adjacent control room plays the tape, or not according to a schedule, only he sees. Sometimes he lets the deck run without tape as a control. Sometimes he feeds in ordinary white noise. The first striking pattern is simple. When the reel is spinning with the tape that came from the folder, most subjects report something. When there is no tape or only white noise, most report nothing. That something, however, is elusive when they try to pin it down. Subject 3. It felt like listening to an argument through a wall. I couldn't make out words, but I knew it was an argument, not a song. Subject 7. More like someone reading a story in a language I don't know. The tone went up and down in the right places, like for suspense. Subject 10. I kept thinking I was about to catch a word I recognized, but it slipped every time. Still, I can tell you where the pauses were. I could almost count the sentences. Subject 12. At first, I thought it was just silence with my own blood in my ears. Then I realized I was waiting for a conclusion. Like when someone is telling you how something bad happened and you haven't got to the bad part yet. One or two say nothing at all, shrugging, asking if the headphones are even on. A few more seem reluctant to speak, as if they're worried about how their answers will be judged. Across all sessions, one phrase recurs enough to be underlined in the summary. It felt like meaning. They are not hearing words, but they are experiencing structure. Rise, fall, emphasis, resolution. Some subjects claimed they could tell roughly how long sentences were, how often it circled back to an earlier idea, how many times it hesitated before changing topic. They talk about an invisible speaker as if they had spent an hour in their company. And yet, when pressed for content, they flounder. One or two venture what they think it might have been about. These guesses differ wildly. Feels like someone confessing. Like a lecture about something technical. Like a bedtime story. None can justify their impressions with specifics. The KGB man has all sessions recorded, ironically on tapes that have sound, and listens to them late, when the institute staff have gone home. He hears the same frustration in each voice, the push and pull between the knowledge that nothing concrete entered their ears and the stubborn conviction that they were spoken to anyway. He begins to suspect that folder tape is either a rare, pure example of suggestion by context, a blank screen onto which people project their own expectation of meaning, or something worse. A vehicle for structure without content, capable of nudging minds without leaving any obvious trace. Both options interest him for different reasons. The Institute, meanwhile, does what institutes do. It runs more tests. The spectrogram specialist refines her analysis. She discovers that the faint structures in the sub- and supersonic ranges are not random smears, but form repeating patterns over time that resemble, uncomfortably, the statistical rhythms of known languages. Not in their specific shapes, but in their distribution of phrases. If you take a long recording of speech and erase all the phonetic details, leaving only the silences and the rough length of utterances, you still get a fingerprint of sorts. Some languages favor long words and short pauses, others shorter bursts and longer gaps. Whatever lives on folder tape in those non-audible bands mimics that fingerprint, but not exactly any language in their archive. She overlays the pattern with profiles for known signal types, encrypted channel noise, coded number stations, even certain kinds of mechanical telemetry. Nothing matches perfectly. Everything matches a little. She writes more cautiously than she feels. Tape appears to carry structured activity outside the primary auditory band. This activity has temporal characteristics close to those of human speech, but frequency distribution inconsistent with known spoken languages. It might represent a transformed, compressed, or otherwise mapped version of semantic content. Further interpretation currently speculative. That paragraph, translated into security language, becomes possible non-standard carrier of information. Non-standard carriers are the stuff of nightmares and fantasies for agencies like this. Ways of embedding orders, coordination, and influence into signals that look like something else. Jamming without noise. Messages in the gaps. The KGB assigns folder tape an asset number. The label object becomes official. The top is moved from the Institute's basement to a secure vault in a building with fewer windows and more locks. Soundroom 3 remains the designated exposure site, but entry now requires clearance. The original folder stays with the object as part of its identity, hence the awkward compound name folder tape. The internal experiments that follow are not kind. No one writes that down. They describe them in humane-sounding terms: extended exposure, cognitive load assessments, semantic anchoring trials. The reality is simpler. They play the tape to people for longer and see what breaks first. In one series, volunteers are asked to listen to the tape for extended periods while trying to memorize sequences of numbers displayed on a small screen in front of them. Control subjects, listening to ordinary silence or broadband noise, perform within expected ranges. Those listening to folder tape consistently perform worse the longer the session continues. It's not a dramatic collapse, not sudden amnesia, more like a slow leak. Digits they could have held easily for seconds just slide away. They describe the feeling as the numbers slipping off to the side. In another, subjects are told they will be asked questions about a short text they read before entering the sound room. They study the text, go into the room, listen to the tape, come out, answer questions. At short exposure times, comprehension loss is minimal. After longer ones, details start to blur. Some subjects mix elements from entirely different texts they read days before. One insists the passage included a phrase that is not in any of the Institute's materials, but does exist in a confidential memorandum he could not have seen. The file phrases this delicately: evidence of subtle cross-contamination between memory traces under extended exposure, possible lowering of boundary between related semantic fields. In plain language, after too long with folder tape in their ears, people's memories pull at each other in odd ways. Not catastrophically. No one comes out believing they are someone else, or that their childhood has been swapped. But in the little things, what color a door was, who told them a particular joke, when exactly they first heard a certain song, their certainty phrase. The KGB man raises a quiet alarm. He isn't afraid of ghosts. He's afraid of anything that interferes with the reliability of human testimony. If there exists a recording that, through some non-acoustic structure, can erode the edges of memory and make people less certain of what they know, that is both a possible weapon and a serious liability. The temptation, of course, is to see if it can be steered. They begin to pair the tape with content. In anchoring trials, as the papers call them, subjects are given a simple narrative before entering Sound Room 3. Sometimes it's a short political speech, sometimes a description of a crime scenario, sometimes a personal story recorded on ordinary tape by someone they know. They listen to the provided content first, then immediately to folder tape, then are asked to recount what they remember. The strange thing is not that their recall degrades. It does, a little. The strange thing is the way it shifts. Certain adjectives appear where none were in the original. Neutral phrases gain a faintly ominous or reassuring tone, depending on who is running the session. A speech that was merely dull suddenly seems, in the subject's retelling, surprisingly persuasive, though they cannot say why. A description of an accident becomes, in their memory, more clearly someone's fault. The KGB man notes, not without some professional excitement, that the direction of that shift can sometimes be influenced by small cues given before the tape plays. A raised eyebrow, a choice of example when explaining the task, a hint about what most people notice. Folder tape, in this view, does not carry a message of its own. It amplifies the grooves already scratched into the subject's mind, deepening some, smoothing others, making them more susceptible to suggestion in that suspended listening state. It is not mind control. It is not hypnosis. It is worse in a way. It is a general solvent that works best where structure already exists, a catalyst for whoever happens to be speaking before and after it, whether they deserve that power or not. There are limits. Some subjects remain stubbornly resistant. They hear nothing and experience nothing beyond boredom and a slight headache. Others report vivid impressions but show no measurable changes in recall or attitude. A few react strongly. The file is thin on direct testimony from those. You can sense the scissors in the gaps. One subject, a mid-level officer who volunteered to see what your ghost tape can do, sits through a long exposure session and emerges unsettled enough to write his own report, unrequested. It was like someone telling me my own life over again, but skipping the parts I expected and dwelling on others, he writes. I felt equal measures of agreement and protest. I kept wanting to say, no, that's not how it happened, but at the same time feeling that perhaps that is exactly how it will be remembered later. He adds a line that the KGB censor underlines twice. At one point, I had the clear sense that the only thing the tape was doing was rearranging which moments I considered important. That is not something a state built on official narratives wants drifting around unchecked. The culmination, the incident that leads to the strange shift across the final decoding logs, does not come from a dramatic breakdown or a confession ripped out by invisible hands. It comes, fittingly, from the equipment itself. The spectrogram specialist, increasingly uneasy about the way the project is evolving, suggests one last, more technical experiment. If the tape contains meaningful non-audible structure, perhaps it can be translated by mapping its patterns onto another domain. The idea is to treat the tape not as sound at all, but as a slow-moving stream of data, instead of playing it to people's ears. Play it to machines designed to recognize patterns in radio transmissions, or to primitive neural networks the Institute has been toying with for image recognition. In one series, they feed the digitized waveform of folder tape into a device usually used for decrypting simple substitution ciphers. The machine is blind to sound, but sensitive to repeated sequences and transitions. It produces a set of best guess mappings, ways of interpreting the tape as if it were encoded text. The output is gibberish, strings of characters with no obvious meaning. But when the KGB's language analysts look at the statistics, they frown. The distribution of symbol frequencies in the output looks uncannily like that of actual text, not in any known language, but within the same general range. It is as if the tape's structure is text-shaped, even when ripped out of its sonic close. In another series, they use a crude classifier to test whether segments of the tape can be reliably distinguished from other recordings in a blind batch. They feed it snippets of white noise, ordinary silence, various environmental sounds, and chunks of folder tape treated as raw numerical sequences. The machine, dumb as it is, learns to tell folder tape apart with unnerving accuracy. It cannot say what it is recognizing, only that this one does not belong with the others, 80–90% of the time. One day, late in the project, an engineer decides to run a different kind of test on his own time. He is working on a system designed to flag anomalies in long-distance communication lines, spikes, dropouts, subtle interference, a kind of automated watchdog for the state's vast network of wires. On a whim, he shouldn't have indulged. He dumps a segment of folder tape's waveform into the watchdog's input as if it were a sample of line noise, then asks the machine to compare it to days' worth of actual transmission logs. He expects a null result. Instead, the machine flags hundreds of matches at low confidence, scattered across months of ordinary traffic. He digs deeper. The matches are not exact copies, just small echoes, patterns of transition that resemble the tape's signature here and there, like fragments of a longer sentence glimpsed through snow. He writes a report that is half technical, half panic. Preliminary comparison suggests that statistical features characteristic of object folder tape may be present at low levels in multiple unrelated transmission channels over extended periods, he writes. This could indicate either that the tape was derived from a composite of line noise, or that some aspect of its structure is more widely embedded in communication systems than previously recognized. Translated. Either folder tape is just a cleverly carved statue out of the same random stone the lines are made of, or the same anomalous pattern is bleeding into everything you send and receive. The KGB's reaction is swift and predictable. They halt all non-essential experiments. They seize the engineer's working notes. They downgrade the Institute's access level to the project. They bring the tape, again, into an even smaller circle. The strange shift in the decoding logs is not a supernatural glitch. It is a change in who is allowed to see what. From that point on, the file becomes patchy. Officially, folder tape is classified as an object of interest, no current operational use, retained for further study. Unofficially, it becomes something more awkward, a recording that makes people doubt the cleanliness of their own channels. There are a few final fragments. A memo from the spectrogram specialist, resigning from direct involvement. She cites professional fatigue and concern about the ethical implications of further exposure experiments. Between the lines, you can see something else. A quiet fear that staring at the patterns any longer will leave grooves in her own thinking she cannot smooth out. A note from the original junior technician, now older, requesting reassignment away from Soundroom 3. His reason is prosaic. I find that after long days working with object folder tape, ordinary silence in my apartment feels like it is about to start talking, he writes. This is interfering with my rest. And then there is a short, unsigned addendum on a loose sheet, maybe slipped in by someone who couldn't bear to let their only comment be filtered through committees. It reads, I listened once, years before any of this was written down properly, before the specialists, before the officers, just me, the tape, and that room. At the time, I thought nothing of it except that it was strange to feel so strongly that someone had told me something when I could not repeat a single word. Lately, I have started to wonder if that was the point. Not to send a particular message, but to leave the sensation of having been addressed. To mark a part of my mind as occupied without filling it. Like drawing a frame without painting the picture. I cannot prove this. It is just that when I think back on that evening, I remember clearly the feeling that something important had been covered, and no content. If an enemy wanted to make us trust messages delivered through a channel we cannot audit, this would be one way. If we did this to ourselves, it is worse. The last official line in the folder tape dossier is dull. Object stored in vault facility. Access by special request only. No ongoing experiments. It wants to sound like the end of a story. An anomaly contained, tagged, and shelved. But the uncomfortable implication hanging over these pages is that the tape may not be unique. That its pattern, whatever it is, might be an extreme, concentrated version of something that runs like a watermark through the background noise of a wired century. A shape in the apparent silence between words, in the timing of clicks, in the breathing gaps of conversations. When you strip all the technical language away, object folder tape is disturbingly simple. It is a recording that convinces people they have been spoken to, even when no voice has sounded in their ears. It erodes their certainty about the borders of their own memories, without leaving them with anything solid to hold instead. It teaches machines trained to find patterns that there's a category of structure they can recognize but not label. Maybe it is just a pathological artifact from a failed experiment in compression. An accidental sculpture carved from the random burble of overloaded circuits. Or maybe, for a brief time, in an unmarked room beneath a forgettable institute, a group of exhausted engineers pushed sound so far through the machinery that it came out the other side. They bled the content away and were left with the bare skeleton of communication, timing, emphasis, expectation. Pure form without flesh. A voice that speaks without words because it no longer needs them to nudge the listener into silence and attention. The security officers who locked it away will tell you, if you ever get them drunk enough to talk about it at all, that they did the sensible thing. That some kinds of information are more dangerous when you do not understand them than when you do. That a tape that might make you doubt your own recollection is an unacceptable risk in a profession that lives and dies by reliable testimony. They will not tell you whether the tape is still in that vault, on that spool, or whether someone long ago, tired of the weight of it, threaded it one last time onto a recorder and let it run out into empty air with the gain turned all the way down. Either way, the thought is hard to shake once you have handled this file, that there might be recordings in the world, fragments on old reels, noise at the bottom of digital tracks, patterns in the filler between programs that do not carry songs or speeches or sensible words, but instead carry this same heavy shape of attention. That feeling you get sometimes when the television has gone mute and you still find yourself looking at it, waiting, as if you have already been told something and are just trying to remember what it was. Folder tape is officially silent. Everyone who has listened to it agrees on that. They also agree, though none of them like to, that silence has rarely felt so full.